Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on how to drive optimization in your business and IT operations and how to get the ROI that you all expect from your digital transformation investments. I'm Fabiana Corredor. I'm part of the marketing team here at Oxys, and I'm very happy to be facilitating the session today. As you can see, I brought three great panelists to the team. So I think that we can start by just some quick introductions. Do you want to start, Bill, with yourself?
Sure, that sounds great. Hello and good afternoon. My name is Bill Woodford. I lead digital transformation for Oxys. My focus is to drive value creation by harnessing the power of technology. I have extensive tech consulting experience with Oxys, Deloitte, and Accenture. In addition, I was a divisional CIO for a global downstream oil and gas company.
Thank you, Bill. Happy to have you here.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Saywitz. I'm a managing director in Oxys's digital transformation practice. My practice focuses on the business side of digital transformation, where we help companies drive returns through the integration of business and technology. By way of background, I have about 30 years of experience across industry and consulting, former KPMG manager, as well as I led the process improvement function for DHL for 7 years globally. So excited to speak to you all today.
Hi, I guess I'll go next. Good morning, everybody. And again, thank you all for joining. Appreciate your time. My name is Dan Day, and I lead the finance transformation and BPO practice here at Oxys. I have over 25 years of leading, executing, and evaluating major change initiatives across organizations and industries. At Oxys, I've spent the last 10 years or so mainly working with CFOs and COOs on large transformation initiatives that leverage technology, process improvement, and outsourcing to deliver peak performance. Really looking forward to speaking with you all today.
Thank you, Dan. So with that, I just wanted to level set and let you know that even though that your lines are muted, you can submit your questions throughout the discussion through the question panel. We'll make sure to address those questions as we go through the discussion or at the end of the session. And yeah, we want to make this as interactive as possible, so your questions are always very welcome. And you know, before kicking it off, this is really the plan of what we're going to cover today. As you know, as we included in the invitation, really probably every company in the US and in the world is experiencing or going through some type of transformation or modernization journey at any level of maturity. But the reality is that a lot of those companies are not really scaling or achieving the results that they were expecting from their digital transformation investments. And that's really the core goal for today, is to really talk about why is it so hard for companies to scale their digital transformation programs? What are some of the key practical insights that our team of experts can provide to incorporate for balance of the year in 2023. So we're gonna go through three key sections, which is the importance of having a vision and how to identify and prioritize your opportunities. We're also gonna talk about specific high impact initiatives that you can start considering today. And lastly, we're gonna talk a little bit about keys for an effective execution, because at the end, everything comes down to execution once you have a great strategy. And as I mentioned, the idea is to cover your questions as we go through the session. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Bill, to get it started.
You know, excellent. This is a very exciting topic. Digital transformation is, I think, on all of your minds as you're making time to join this call. As you look at this quote from Gartner, 4 of 5 CIOs are increasing digital tech investments. There are some reasons there. You're experiencing these economic pressures, inflation, talent. We saw from some of your feedback some of the challenges of attracting and retaining talent, supply constraints, among other items. We wanted to spend a few minutes before jumping into the specifics to take a step back and think about DT and what's the value that that can provide. What are the benefit categories? Many of you probably think cost savings, and that's an evident one. So that's broadly covered under operational excellence. So as you think about operational excellence, that's really about driving efficiency and effectiveness. And with that, hyperautomation in particular can drive dramatic improvements in efficiency and allow people to focus on higher value activities. We've seen tremendous results with our intelligent automation practice, realizing those benefits. Another dimension of that is that with digital technologies, they can provide much greater consistency, which allows for significant improvements in quality. So long and short, that's a higher quality of service at a lower cost. A very powerful combination. Next, let's talk about agile and scalable. Markets and business models continue to change. Businesses need to adapt or they will decline. Digital technologies can enable a more flexible operating model that scale efficiently. So the beauty of this is that with investments in DT, your current operations can be more efficient, and then with economic improvement, with business growth, you can scale much more efficiently. Another powerful aspect of these digital platforms is that there's much more data in terms of how they operate. This allows for bringing more science to the art of decision making. There's real power in leveraging the insights, the signals that come in from the operations to make decisions and to take full advantage of those. We do see some mixed results with our clients, and then we help them drive more value within the insights and analytics space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Innovation is another broad area that drives tremendous value. And what we see is that, many companies today, they may have grown through acquisitions. It may have just been organic growth. But as a result of that, the teams are focused on keeping the lights on, and they really have no capacity to do additional work, to do continuous improvement. And innovation through DT can create that capacity. There can be higher performing teams that can enable the business to evolve and to further enable continuous improvement. So that's a very exciting aspect. Connecting back to talent and the employee experience, there needs to be a rethinking of job functions with DT. There's an elevation of the roles. There's the ability for people to do more, and their responsibilities should reflect that, as they will have a greater capacity to perform higher value work. And then a side effect of that is that with that work, it's even more rewarding. So that can help address some of the talent issues. And thematically, I would also say that gets back to a critical aspect of change management. And when we talk about kind of leading practices and driving effective execution, you really can't overemphasize the importance of change management. And finally, certainly not least importance-wise, is customer satisfaction. Executing with higher quality service allows you to protect your existing customers, to protect that business. So the increased quality of service with greater efficiency puts you in a position where you're delivering results for your customer.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, well, let's keep rolling. So, the reality is that transformations are complex. You see some statistics that are represented here. Many programs, they can take longer than expected. They may not realize the targeted outcomes. There is a very high demand level for talent, and that will likely continue for the foreseeable future. So not only is talent in demand, it's in very high demand for the right skill sets to deliver digital transformation types of projects. As we think about that, there's the reality. The pace of technology change is accelerating. I'm sure many of you have seen some of the articles about generative AI, ChatGPT, Bard, others like that. It's moving very fast and will continue to move at a rapid pace. So as you think about this from a business perspective, the technology landscape is evolving rapidly. It creates the potential for major disruption. So I view business somewhat like a full contact sport. It's competitive. Digital transformation is an extremely important part of navigating that change, and having the expertise to navigate that digital modernization journey is essential, and having the right partners, the right skill sets is critical to help you achieve those successful results.
Yeah, and I think what it's interesting, Bill, is that what we're seeing here in terms of the challenges of what companies are expressing and the level of failure from the digital transformation programs is very in line with what our attendees responded when they registered for the webinar. So if you see here, these are your responses. And when we ask you what were the main challenges that were holding you back from achieving your digital transformation goals, the two main ones were talent shortages and digital skills gaps, together with insufficient budgets. And the other part that was very interesting that we kind of like see it together is not having a clear vision or roadmap of opportunities, or not having a clear business case on what you're really planning to get from the identified opportunities. So the idea today is to talk a little bit about how you can go through these struggles. And then what we thought was very interesting too is, even though that we have people joining from specific functions, in some cases CFOs, COOs, CIOs, or specific executives within a function, the majority of you are targeting improvements across different departments. Definitely finance and accounting and IT have historically been two core areas for grasping those opportunities for cost optimization, but definitely other areas, including back office, front office, and customer support operations, as well as HR, is also coming as another priority. So I wanted to open it up to you, Keith. How does this kind of like compare to what you're seeing and hearing from your customers?
Yeah, it's super interesting. And we meet with customers every day that are going down this journey. And two of them that I drill into is the vision and roadmap piece of it. We see a lot of companies today that they don't take the time to build a vision or don't take the time to build an actual roadmap, and they're kind of sticking their toe in the water a little bit. And there's a lot of priorities in the organization, and then whichever stakeholder kind of has maybe the biggest stick gets some of their things prioritized, but it's not part of a holistic program. It doesn't really get the benefits that they were expecting to get out of it. And then it kind of stalls the overall program. So we see that quite a lot. And we see the situation where companies will have multiple different opportunities in front of them, and they can't come to a consensus on what to do first or second or third, or even how to quantify the benefits. So they just kind of spend time ruminating and never really get to the point that they jumpstart their program and get moving. So that's something we see very commonly. The other thing I drill into is this idea, the first one, talent shortage and digital skills gap. That's an interesting one, because one of the things that we see in companies that start and then aren't successful is that they understand that maybe they don't have all the right skills, but what they do is they don't want to make the investment in bringing in outside talent. So they attempt to execute these programs in the spare time of other business leaders who don't have the spare time to really do it, but they still put the burden on them. Or they try to execute programs with people that have never really been through a real transformation before. And as a result of that, it also kind of stalls and never gets to where it needs to be. Maybe the resources had success in other areas, and you're like, oh, I'm going to have them take this on. But it's kind of a recipe for failure, because these transformations are complex in nature. We see a lot of companies that want to implement, and they've implemented some software before, and they say that's their view of digital transformation, which isn't really the same thing. Just implementing a piece of software and really transforming, which involves change management and business process change, is really what drives that. And then I'll just highlight something that we don't see in this list, which I hear all the time with companies, especially companies that have kind of grew organically over time, and maybe they have multiple ERPs and a lot of technical debt. A lot of times these companies don't start their journey at all because they think that technical debt is too complicated in order to overcome. They don't have data harmonization, they don't have a single source of truth, so they just don't move, which really is a recipe to move to obsolescence eventually, right? One way or the other, you've got to bite off take a bite of that apple and get moving. And you just have to work with someone that's experienced in knowing how to solve those problems, as opposed to letting them overwhelm you.
Yeah. Dan, any thoughts that you want to add?
Yeah, just tacking on to some of what Keith was saying. When I'm speaking with CFOs and COOs, traditionally I hear a lot more around talent and org-driven resistance than around budget, right? Why is that? Usually there's a pretty strong business case and a fast payback, so finding the money is kind of less of a concern. As many of the initiatives, if they're implemented well, they'll pay for themselves pretty quickly. So while the budget may not have been set aside, they're in a sense they could be self-funding or they've got a good enough payback that the savvy CFOs and COOs know that they can find the money to pay for them. But usually there's a lot of hesitancy related to the talent, the org prioritization, right? Things like, do we have the skills internally to execute? Is my organization too bogged down in firefighting, so it hasn't been able to invest the time needed to innovate or to challenge the status quo, or they've brought real small bits and pieces of initiatives together and they're just not big enough or transformational enough to get through kind of the priority list of things that the organization needs to focus on, because organizationally digital transformation has to be embraced, not just within a department. Now, as the economy is starting to get a little bit more uncertain and change, some of those, kind of the resistance of the organization and the insufficient budget, some of that's coming together, right? Because there's a lot more scrutiny to the business cases, right? A lot more, call it risk factors that are being applied to make sure that the organization is really going to be able to deliver on time and recognize the full benefit that's laid out in the business case. So, we're starting to hear that the decisions are slowing, and a lot of it is because, kind of the number one is creeping into number two, and it's being a lot more heavily weighted in making that decision. And then, the stuff on the right, this is definitely what we're seeing. I think traditionally there's been a lot more, IT and finance driven work within kind of the organizations that we typically work with. But we're definitely hearing a lot more on, front office, customer facing, and a lot of the, what I would call middle office, right? Kind of the handoffs between the back office and the front office where they're coming together. A lot of initiatives targeting those areas. In the front office, it's usually more around, execution excellence and efficiency and customer experience and things like that. And kind of in that middle handoff, it's more around, cleaner handoffs, reducing exceptions, and kind of the manual processes that have put in place to bridge those gaps. So definitely both sides consistent with kind of what we've seen in the marketplace.
Do you guys still see these different departments working in silos and somehow trying to do transformational initiatives at the department level, but not necessarily cohesively?
Yeah, I'll add a quick comment to that. I think first we see a lot of cases of, as we touched on, companies that are reluctant to move forward. But in cases where organizations are moving forward, it's often not in a cohesive manner, where departments are almost doing proof of concepts or sort of dabbling, if you will, but it's not from a top-down vision standpoint. It's not really focused on transforming and driving business outcomes. We do commonly see that.
Yeah. So I think with that, I'm going to launch the first polling question for the audience. So you can answer live, and I'm going to share the results with you in a second. So basically, how would you rate your organization's progress in achieving operational excellence through digital transformation? Highly successful, moderately successful, somewhat successful, not successful, or no results yet? So if you guys start submitting your votes, I'll share them in around 30 seconds to allow more answers. Okay, so we have 60% of the votes. So very interesting. As you guys see, people are being somewhat honest. So only 6% consider themselves to be highly successful, 20% moderately successful, the majority, 53%, it's kind of like in the middle, somewhat, and then 12% not successful at all, and 6% have not really started. Any thoughts, any surprises with those results, Keith?
I think that's probably what everyone expected to see. That, and even the two in the middle, moderately and somewhat successful, are very similar in nature. So the vast majority look at this as a mixed bag, and I think that's what we see across companies that don't kind of fully commit.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So with that, let's really jump into the next session. I think, you know, based on the challenges that we discussed, it seems that a big part of the problem is really getting started, identifying the opportunities, deciding what to prioritize. Every company has a lot of things that they could be doing, but they just don't know how to build that roadmap. So I think it would be great to get some practical insights, and maybe we can start with you, Bill, in terms of what advice would you give to these companies in these early stages of defining their roadmap?
You know, I would say as an analogy, if you think about something like, you know, buying a house, you probably think first about some macro themes of where you would like it to be, the type of house, etc. But before you even get into specific priorities, in the case of DT, it's important to have a macro view, like the house example I gave, to provide the framing of where the focus should be. Because there are transformations, but that doesn't mean you have to transform the entire organization at the same time. So it's a matter of then defining, ultimately, based on business strategy and the outcomes that we're targeting, what is that vision? It's defining where does the organization want to go. It's providing that North Star, that direction of here's where we want to go, and then ultimately articulating the outcomes of what it looks like when we get there. Without that framing, that leads to the scenario that we just talked about of kind of pockets of activity happening that's not in a cohesive manner. This allows that to be organized, and with that organization effect through the vision, that enables proper prioritization, and it becomes a force multiplier in terms of the value that DT can deliver.
Yeah. In your case, Keith, I think when it comes to opportunity prioritization, a lot of the times we're big proponents of really starting with an assessment. I think it would be great for you to kind of like explain the value of that and what's the importance of an assessment.
Yeah. It's super interesting. Like, one of the first comments that you made early on, Fabi, was that execution is the most important thing. But if execution is the most important thing, then the second most important thing is knowing what to execute on, and how to even prioritize those types of things. And what makes starting with an assessment so important, first off, is just linking to what Bill was just talking about, which is what are the goals of your company overall? We see companies all the time execute and prioritize something because, as I was saying before, maybe it's something that seems like it's on fire and it happens kind of down in the organization. But when it's not aligned to what the goals of the business are, you may be investing a bunch of time and effort in optimizing something that isn't even important to the business. Like, we'll see examples of companies that are optimizing maybe a revenue cycle or a billing process, and it's for a business unit which isn't even at the top of strategic leadership's goals for the upcoming year. I have a friend who's a CEO of a company, and he talks about how the number one thing that he spends his time doing is getting people to stop doing things that aren't the priorities of the organization. So starting with an assessment that links to your goals is really paramount to everything you do. You need to know what the business benefit of that is going to be compared to the effort. You need to measure and determine what are the areas that, how many different departments does it impact, and is that even the right thing to start with? Are you looking for something that's more low-hanging fruit in order to prove the value proposition and then move forward? But an assessment lets you start with items that are aligned to your goals and it lets you start with items that you understand what the benefit's going to be, and then can use that to permeate that across the organization. So the other thing I would add is that any good assessment is geared and tied to that 5th bullet there, which is defining a roadmap. You know, something that you need to do is you start with an assessment which says these are the items that are going to add value to my organization, and then you prioritize those based on where you need to go and have a real plan in order to get there. So those two things linking together is super important.
Right, and I think they also tied down to actually building the business case, because going back to the beginning, as you were saying, companies are doing much more, you know, disciplined approaches towards approving budgets. So without an assessment, you cannot quantify the actual business case to get it approved. What would you say are some of the key tips for building the business case? And also, I think the benchmarks is an interesting element that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely building the business case and the importance of leveraging benchmarks, right? The benchmarks are critical because it gives you, most organizations are so used to looking at processes internally and how much better they've gotten, but they don't really know what's good, right? What's perfect, what's excellence look like, and that's where benchmarking comes in. And it really helps you up front. It helps you prioritize, hey, this is the areas where I've got a ways to go, where I'm underperforming benchmarks or performing as a bottom performer, and I've got runway within that. So as you're setting the prioritization, right, looking at places where there's room to improve, benchmarks are really important. And then as you're through the journey, to have kind of continuous review of that, as you're implementing and getting better, you want to know when you've kind of passed the second inflection point, right? The first is when you're starting to improve, but then the second one, when you're starting to marginally slow down, right? So you're getting past the point of continuing to invest. So it's time to move on to other initiatives. So, benchmarks are super important. We use APQC and internal benchmarks that we have from our operation, because we can see across, lots of different industries and functions. But it's really important, not only in the front end, but as you're kind of going through the journey to understand what sort of progress you're making. And then the other thing, and it's tied into up front with the business case and then measuring success, is you really need to understand what your baseline was and define very clear success criteria when you're building the business case, right? Am I taking cost out? Am I driving efficiency? Am I reducing rework? Am I reducing exceptions? Am I improving customer experience? Whatever that criteria is, you need to be clear on what it is and have measurement in place to be able to get a read on that as you're going through. There's so many CFOs that I talk to, they're lamenting the fact that, there was a business case, but for whatever factors, it wasn't delivered on time. They didn't quite get the benefits they were expecting. They don't have a read on it to understand if they got it. You want to make sure that you've got mechanisms in place to read it and to hold folks accountable to deliver what they said in the organization. And more importantly, you want to be able to celebrate quick wins, right? It's very likely that if you do this right and you do it successfully, you'll be able to dramatically change the performance of the function that you're transforming. And so you need to be able to have quantification of that so that people have a reason to celebrate, right? So that you can, keep momentum in the team. People, feel the quick wins and they get excited and they keep momentum around the organization and they're looking for the next thing that they should be doing. But if you don't have an understanding of where you're trying to get to and have mechanisms in place of what you're expected to deliver, right, it's very often you're going to find yourself 5 or 6 months into a program and saying, where am I going with this? Our organization's lagging.
Maybe I could add something there just real quickly. I think it's super important. I mean, this line almost really should probably be a circle as opposed to a straight line, because one of the places that companies often will come back and say, I implemented some kind of transformation program, or I put in a new ERP or whatever the scenario is, and I expected this benefit and I had this benefit and then it was gone. is that this measurement piece is that because the business isn't stagnant and constantly changing, it's very quick that your benefits start to get eroded away. And if you're not constantly measuring, did I not add an incremental headcount that I shouldn't have added in? Did I not account for something? That measurement piece, without it, some people say if you're not going to measure it, don't do it. And that may be a slight exaggeration, but it's not a huge one.
Yeah, there's an interesting question that I think ties well to the topic and to the view of the value of digital transformation beyond cost savings. But it says, finally, I start to see tech companies moving from the business model of showing how many headcounts you can cut with RPA and intelligent automation and really focusing on how these technologies can actually improve employee satisfaction. What is your opinion on it?
Yeah, I'll add a comment to that. That's one of the reasons that when we opened this call, I wanted to spend a few minutes and talk about the why and the broad benefit categories. I couldn't agree more that with automations, that has a directly related improvement in employee satisfaction by them being able to focus on higher value activities. So that's completely a true statement. There's a lot of power for the talent and employees, and a lot of power in delivering more to customers. I think to that, on the customer side, you could argue that with customer service, time is a dimension of that, and being able to perform that consistent quality of service on time is extremely important to protect that customer and how we provide service to that customer. So to me, focusing on pure cost savings alone is doing a disservice to DT, and the broader benefit is much bigger than that.
Yeah,
I would add something to that.
I'd
because
like
I think
to
it's
go ahead. Well, let me go, Keith, and then you can go. So, as someone who's got a lot of employees underneath them, right? Because I lead the BPO operation and have people in multiple countries, very large teams. We practice what we preach. So, a lot of these things we've implemented within our own organization. Definitely job satisfaction, lower attrition, the ability for people. Folks want to be innovative, right? They don't want to be coming in and doing the transactional jobs, the transactional work. Now, a big chunk of our business model is taking that transactional work out of your organization and taking it into ours. So, kind of our goal once we get it is to find ways to make that work interesting and innovative and allow people to have, career opportunities and career growth by finding ways to do things better and changing the nature of the job so that they're not just focused on keying in a transaction or entering a process manually or being a manual interface between two systems that should be integrated, right? Giving them the opportunity to do their job differently and to focus on kind of the more innovative aspects of their work so that they're a little bit more fulfilled in their careers.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think with that, I think it would be great to start talking about specific examples and some of the key strategies and programs that you are seeing across customers being picked within the prioritization. And I think these three that you're seeing on the slide, intelligent automation, BI, and outsourcing, are definitely very predominant. So maybe Bill, we can start with you in terms of the intelligent automation.
That sounds great. Thanks, Bobby. So we've touched on intelligent automation. There are major efficiency gains that are possible. It's common to see those north of 25%. We have specific scenarios that can be 35 to 50%. But just as we touched on, that efficiency becomes an enabler for these other aspects to focus on higher value work, to be able to innovate, et cetera. What's interesting is that, intelligent automation has been around, and then the robotic process automation has been around for a significant period of time. And those have tended to automate historically, more types of the transactional, very procedural types of activities. That has been changing over the last couple of years, but there's been a step function change more recently. And an example I'll use for that is for generative AI. And specifically, it's really a broad field, but when you look at the large language models, there is now the ability to automate even more complex functions. So kind of bringing it up a level from the procedural, and to do that in a much more human-like way. So as you think about scenarios like improving analysis, identifying exceptions, prioritizing tasks, and responding to all types of requests, internal, external, etc., it allows a further elevation of what the people are working on. And I would say related to that, I think this is diminishing somewhat, but there was a view on the people side that DT was going to, take jobs, etc. And I see it differently as an elevation of jobs, and that people are performing higher value work and growing through that. So there's clearly a lot of hype around generative AI. It shows a lot of promise, and then we have some experience in this space in particular. And I would say there are some important dimensions to get in place in terms of prompting, how those prompts are structured, because slightly different types of prompts generate materially different results. And then having a framework in place, responses come back from those to make sure there's a controlled mechanism, because you don't want, there are cases with these large language models when there are responses that aren't valid for that scenario. So there has to be a mechanism to manage that as well. It is exciting though to see this continued path of what, kind of where we're going with automations and where we're going with other digital technologies. So, I think we're likely to see more change in the next few years than what we've seen in the last 10. And that means, I think, for those who have maybe, those organizations that have gotten by not transforming, I think that's becoming a riskier and riskier proposition.
And I think it's interesting, Bill, because as you said, RPA has been going for a while, 5 to 7 years, but the reality is that it's still, from mid to large companies, they haven't necessarily scaled RPA yet. So now they're getting thrown with this generative AI and ChatGPT. And that, don't you feel that for them, they may still feel that it's too early for them if they haven't tackled the basics to go into generative AI type of technologies? Like, what advice would you give to some of the companies that are still super early on their RPA journey?
I think the macro theme, and it certainly would apply to this, is it's important to consider working with partners and those that have some expertise in the space. Don't rely on having your staff kind of Google something, do some research, and then putting people who maybe don't have the skill set or are not in a position to really advance that can be a misuse of time for some people that aren't the right fit for that. So, what we see with organizations of all sizes is there is a strong value in leveraging the power of an ecosystem and doing that where it makes sense for your organization.
Yeah. And Keith, in the case of BI and analytics, it's interesting because a lot of people don't necessarily associate analytics with cost savings, but then the value of visibility, it's in the future does translate into tangible results. So what would you say in terms of BI?
Yeah, so BI and analytics is interesting because it's certainly super interesting coming right after a conversation on generative AI and RPA, because clearly the adoption is still earlier, although there's good adoption in RPA and we're very early stages for generative AI. But on the BI side, I think we've seen most organizations have clearly embraced BI, and I think most organizations understand that the only way to really drive your organization to excellence is to be a data-driven decision-making company, and that companies that are truly putting data at the forefront outpace their competition, because data-based decisions versus anecdotal ones are clearly a difference. What I would highlight, though, is that I still see lots of companies, and there's a couple of areas where they're struggling in this space. One that I would highlight is that we see lots of companies where they have staff that can create dashboards, and they have staff that can build a data cube and build the integrations from their other systems in order to populate to populate information in order to build analytics. But where they lag, and those functions seem to be IT-based functions, And what we
Yeah.
see companies lag is that the business expertise to really help companies focus on what should they be analyzing? How can they move to be more forward looking? And what happens oftentimes is that we have a functional owner in accounting or finance or operations, and they work with their IT owner, and the IT owner is basically saying, tell me what you want to measure. And the functional leader is saying, well, I'm not sure. So that piece to bridge the gap about what questions should be answered and how do I get to a place where I'm predicting the future as opposed to just looking backwards. That's a big gap that we still see in companies. And then the other area to highlight is that I think too many companies let themselves be kind of held back by concerns over data quality, as opposed to building a plan in order to harmonize your data and answer questions. They just let that kind of stagnate themselves. And the real approach there needs to be that you should identify the business questions that you can answer and answer them, and then identify the business questions that you can't answer well and put in place a plan to solve those data issues, so you can answer those questions in the future. But the just sitting still never works, right? I think we're at a place now where everyone kind of agrees, I have to be able to measure, I have to be able to look forward, and what I should measure and what I should look forward for and how do I fix my issues is really at the forefront.
And do you see, because it's so interesting, like first is what do you want to measure, and then telling the story of what the data is saying. Don't you find some companies actually have the data that they need, but they still haven't incorporated it into their rhythms of actually reviewing the data and making decisions based on the data? Because, for example, it happens to me, right? As you know, at Oxys internally, we have all of these Power BI dashboards for all of the different functions. And even within my marketing team, I cannot get to actually look at the data in the frequency that I would want to. Sometimes there's more data than what I can actually digest. So what thoughts do you have in terms of that?
Yeah, I think it's about the business process that go along with it, right? We see
Right.
that all the time, is that at the senior level, a lot of organizations will prioritize and really create all of this data, and then they never get it to permeate to the lower levels in the organization that are actually making the decisions on a day-to-day basis, right? There's a bunch of data that's available, there's dashboards, there's forward-looking reporting, but then you never really shifted and made the change management impact in the business processes so that there's a cadence behind it, right? Like, let's say from a marketing review perspective, that I have a weekly marketing meeting where people have to present data and show why they're making a database decision. That whole cadence that goes along with it, a lot of times is the gap I think you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you, Keith. I think in terms of the third program, then definitely outsourcing as a driver of cost reduction has been there for a while, but the perspective on how outsourcing drives digital transformation,
Yeah, so we see this particularly in kind of the middle market and private equity space, less so kind of in the enterprise space. They've already got big transformation, continuous improvement. They're using outsourcing for different reasons, but particularly within the middle market space and within the private equity space, we see organizations that have failed to do these programs either because they're high growth or their processes aren't great or their data is not clean. Or, there's a myriad of reasons why. But they go through this journey where, they move the transactional work to an outsourcer, which allows the organization to focus and be more strategic. Then they kind of take that savings, from that transactional work that's moved to fund some of the initial investment to kind of get started within a digital transformation process. And then ultimately they end up partnering with the outsourcer to deliver it. So as an example, within our service offering, our operating model, we embed several technology tools that, the middle market companies may not actually have on their own, and to implement them would be multiple individual projects, but we can leverage our scale and offer them as part of it. So not only intelligent automation and BI, but other technologies to help, run the operation better, right? Service management tools, automated workflows, AI-enabled OCR, chatbots, close automation tools, those sorts of call it wrapper technologies we bring, to the table as part of our operating model. So from a resistance to change, permeating, an existing organization, or having to have access to, or the skill set, or the funding to fund the tools. A lot of times we see folks, using, their outsourcer to jumpstart, kind of that journey, especially if their existing programs are not existent or just failing to launch.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think with that, maybe we can pull our second polling question, which is basically asking the audience, first of all, regarding generative AI, with tools such as ChatGPT, how much have you really incorporated that as part of your automation program? Not yet, currently searching, in the pipeline, piloting on a specific use case, or implementing it broadly across multiple use cases. So if you can submit your answers, we'll display in a couple of seconds. Definitely, we don't expect much progress here yet, but it will be interesting to see the answers. So I have 25% of the votes. Let's wait for a couple of more.
I'm really interested to see this one.
Me too.
I mean, I know there's heavy adoption at the middle school, high school, and university level. I'm very interested to see how it's permeating organizations.
No, and I think individually, everyone is probably using it somehow in their roles, but in a more orchestrated way and controlled by the organization. That's where I don't think so. So
80+% not yet, I say.
yeah, so if you see, 8% said not yet, 69% are saying currently researching, and then just 23% are piloting on a specific use case. So no one is really doing it across more than one use case at this point.
Yeah. I'm curious, or I would bet that there's a lot more ChatGPT usage in organizations that they don't know about because they're not part of defined ChatGPT programs, but people just using it to write a job description that they have to draft, or to, write a quick email response on something that they haven't gotten started yet. So not part of main, we call it main programs, but more shadow operations, from individual users.
Yeah, and that's true, but I would say obviously we're focused on solving more complex business challenges and how to apply those as a part of embedding those in the business process. But absolutely.
But then the data governance and all of that comes into play
right.
as part of that, right?
100%.
Thank you. And I'll pull the last polling question after this, but I thought it was interesting to really go through some real world success stories, because even if these three industries here are completely different, from healthcare to restaurants and hospitality to technology, the strategies that they're using are very similar. So I think, Keith, if we want to start with you on the first story and go from there.
Yeah, so super interesting use case here. And I think the real takeaway here for this scenario is really outside of the idea of the specific industry that this customer was in, which was a healthcare and medical device company, which we do a lot of work in this space. Is that the most important piece to take away from this is that the use of intelligent automation, the use of RPA, driven with an assessment, was really able to find multiple different areas where you could take processes that are highly repetitive, where, to the point that we were speaking about before, that Dan was mentioning, that in a world where it's increasingly difficult to find staff to execute repetitive tasks and still have strong employee satisfaction, that these types of processes, billing and renewals, cash application processes, authorizations and pre-authorizations, these kind of highly repetitive tasks that require strong accuracy, that require that can impact revenue if they're not executed in a timely manner, by kind of executing an opportunity assessment, identifying where the real benefits are, and then creating a roadmap for a customer to implement multiple different automations as part of a program, really drives success. And that, although it's applicable in the medical industry, it's applicable in many other similar industries.
Thank you. Then in the case of the hospitality,
Yeah, sure. So this was a super interesting case study. Global restaurant franchisor that operates across 55 plus countries, multiple brands, experiencing rapid growth. But during the pandemic, there was a travel, particularly within international, where because of travel restrictions, they couldn't provide the traditional franchisee support and audit processes that they would, that's embedded into their operating model, right? So in that industry, there's heavy emphasis on in-store visits and making sure that the local franchisee is complying with brand standards and health and safety and kind of the operating guidelines of the operator. So and travel is shut down in various countries, they weren't able to do that. So if you kind of think through where they were going, this is kind of the lifeline of support that they have to make sure that their brands are being operated in accordance with standards. So what did they do? They created this customer experience center of excellence out of one of our centers in Costa Rica, where they're using coaches and they're combining teleconferencing via kind of one of the traditional teleconferencing technologies out there, kind of a virtual audit program technology, and kind of a scheduling and CRM system to kind of change that model on its head. So now they're able to perform those store visits virtually. Initially it was done out of necessity, but now as an ongoing program, they've continued to add on it. So it's less about compliance, it's more becoming a franchisee support model where they're getting consistency in the coaches that are doing the conversations. They're getting more data back from these store visits. They're able to do them more frequently because they're doing it virtually. And so they've taken all of that and they've built an analytics portal around it. They've built a franchisee support program and portal around it, where if questions are coming in because they didn't get their marketing material or they're having supply chain issues getting some of their ingredients or paper products or any of that, there's now kind of a new experience that they go through to provide better support. And that has since been added to where we're now doing POS support and IT technical support for the franchisees as well. So what started, what's the saying, necessity is the mother of invention. Out of necessity, right, it sparked kind of this whole transformational program that is kind of spreading across their organization, and then now to to other restaurants in their other players in their industry.
And I think that also talks down a lot about the trend of the role of shared services and outsourcing going beyond the traditional transactional type of activity and really starting to use it for functions that never even existed before. So that's another trend that we're seeing.
It's the pace of technology and the use of technology and collaboration tools and analytics and all of those things coming together. It's really turning some of the traditional models on their head. Now you've got to be comfortable with change, right, and willing to and have strong champions, right, to be able to push that major change initiative through. But when it works, I mean, it can literally transform the industry. So in this case, they were lucky if they, especially on an international basis, if they could get in once or twice a year. Now they're visiting at least once a quarter virtually. All the expense related to physically traveling and doing that to the stores, that's been eliminated. And then ultimately the franchisees are happier with it because it's less intrusive, right? There's more consistency with kind of the coach that's delivering it. You can follow up on items that were identified in the previous visit, and you can kind of showcase, hey, look, I did what I was supposed to do and here's the result. So it's really turned from a compliance focused initiative to kind of a store coaching and operational excellence sort of initiative.
Yeah, and I think before we jump into the next section to really talk about some of the final thoughts and guiding principles for successful execution, Bill, do you want to touch on this test automation success story?
Absolutely. I'll briefly touch on this. So this applies to other industries. It happens to be for a global tech company. And ultimately, this is about proactively managing testing to make sure that automations are running smoothly. So as a part of that, the whole idea is to make sure that there was quality when moving from things from a lower environment to production and being able to continuously test lower environments. This resulted in being able to have an increased speed in production and to increase the quality of the testing that was done. So I'll use an example of that because automations for any organization can become a central component of how it operates. So as you think about something like month-end closing, that's something that you're performing and you expect it to work, and there's a tight timeline to complete those activities. Automations are often supplementing that. And then what was done in this case is you're running tests on those automations right before you go through the month-end process. Is this client in particular had a fairly dynamic environment, and with that dynamic environment, there were automations that were breaking. So this was a way to get in front of that and to make sure that those automations were running smoothly.
Yeah, and I think this is like one of the most mature RPA COEs that we have worked with hundreds and hundreds of automations, but I think that more and more, even for companies in the early stages of their journey, we're really advising them to get test automation embedded early on, for proactive maintenance and avoiding those robots for breaking when they go live. Thank you. So I think with that, I'm going to jump the last polling question and we're going to go to some last final thoughts. But basically, we would love to hear from all of these specific programs that the panelists shared. In which of the following strategies are you increasing your focus for balance of the year? Are you really focusing on assessing the opportunities and building that roadmap that you don't have as clear? Are you just working on accelerating the delivery of your current automation pipeline and the opportunities that you have already identified? Are you working on analytics, or are you working on increasing the use of shared services and outsourcing? Hopefully you don't pick option number 5. and keep in mind that you can set more than one. Okay. So I'll share the results in a second. I have 15% of the votes. Would love to get some more, 20%. And I know we're on the top of the hour. I think we're gonna close in around 5 minutes. It took a little bit longer, but hopefully some of you can stay. So I'm gonna share the results. Interesting, 57% of people are just working on accelerating their current pipeline of automation, 14% on analytics, and then 29% increasing the use of shared services and outsourcing. Hopefully all of them have a good roadmap and assessment, but what are your thoughts, Keith? I'm surprised to see that nobody's really focusing on that portion of building the roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes hand in hand, that the idea of accelerating your current automation pipeline kind of gets tied in with, identifying what those opportunities are at the same time. So I think those things go a bit hand in hand.
They could. Well, we would just reinforce begin with the end in mind.
Yeah. Excellent. So with that, I'm gonna jump this polling question, and I would love to hear from you, Bill, on what we were saying. I think you touched already on some of these points, but a strategy is hallucination without execution. So what are some of the key things that you see companies do really well when it comes to execution?
Thanks. And so I'll go through these in a fairly quick manner, and it's really thematic, and we've touched on many of these as we've gone through the discussion. But from a talent standpoint, in terms of delivering DT and delivering those functions, it takes a mix of skill sets, it takes expertise, it takes know-how to do that. So Certainly you can look for talent, but I would say don't hesitate to tap into a partner ecosystem. Trying to do it on your own is a risky proposition. I would also say there's a real power in real-time collaboration, and I think this is even amplified with DT. The pace that these projects can move, the need for a connection to business, product owners, stakeholders, etc. The work is done much more efficiently when there is that real-time collaboration. That's been certainly the Auxis experience. There is a finding from McKinsey that reinforces that, and the direct correlation. It's not even kind of a loose correlation. It is absolutely direct between productivity and being in similar time zones to achieve the targeted results in a rapid manner. Dan had touched on this point, and I think a lot of delivery of DT and even of other projects has moved to a more incremental manner. That certainly applies to DT. Get the velocity going. There are wins. That feeds energy to the team. That builds the muscle memory to move faster. It also delivers speed to value. It allows those signals to come back based on what's implemented, that there can be minor course corrections along the way. The fourth point, and this is really for executive leadership, is that DT and large programs, it isn't a kickoff at the beginning and you highlight some things and you just sort of let the teams run with it. This is something that periodically, every couple or 3 months, having executive leadership reinforce the importance of a DT program is important, because without that, we talked about the silos. These pocketed silos tend to pop up and people tend to start working on things that can deviate from the mission. And it's also important to celebrate wins. I mean, teams put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in some of these projects, so make sure that that hard work is recognized. Change management, we can't overemphasize that. Roles change. People are just reluctant to change overall. I mean, that's just the nature of human beings. So make sure to over-rotate on change management, manage that process, and that the roles and responsibilities, the work that's being performed, is set up in a way to be in that future operating mode. We've talked about measurement and kind of making sure actions are taken to realize the business case. We've talked about that already, I think, fairly thoroughly. Another thing is have a governance framework. There are rhythms that are required to integrate across teams, to integrate across departments, to have steering committees. This helps manage dependencies, helps drive more value, it mitigates risks, and then project teams run into issues. They need to have a way to escalate those and get those resolved, but ultimately the teams should be doing a lot of the work and then engaging stakeholders to get clarity where needed.
Thank you, Bill. Dan, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing to add to that is, having that vision and aligned on that vision is so important up front. Just, Bill said it, right? The teams are going to run into challenges, right? Some of these initiatives take time, right? And you lose momentum, and, and there will be unintended things that pop up that you didn't anticipate or you didn't realize. And it's so important to have that vision that you can anchor back to and say, hey, this is why we were doing it, and this is what we said we were going to do, to kind of right the ship kind of in moments that get a little bit tough. And having that vision up front to anchor back to, and that alignment up front, to me is critical to keeping it going.
Thank you, Dan. Keith, any last thoughts?
I would just say that digital transformation ultimately is about utilizing technology, but at the end of the day, technology change business processes, and technology business process changes change the roles of staff. And the change management piece there, if you implement technology but don't look at the impacts across areas, a billing change from a technology perspective also impacts all the finance processes downstream. So that whole change management piece and the business processes that permeate across departments, if you're not considering those things, that's a really likely place that you're going to fail.
Yeah. Well, there were some questions around if we were gonna send a copy of the presentation. So yes, if you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll share a copy of the recording and the presentation afterwards. There's also a final question because the other ones we can address in private, but I thought this one was interesting. What do you think about finance departments hiring programmers, having someone that really understands both worlds? We did that at Bahamar Hospitality company, and it's working phenomenally for us. Less complex process is being done by this person, and as soon as it's stable, we consider moving it to our partner.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely if you can find folks that have kind of the finance skills and the programming skills, right? If you can find those folks, that's great, right? It's, yeah, we talk about, programs being business led, right? Those are the ones that are most effective. So if you can find kind of that hybrid, right, that understands the finance processes and the accounting processes and can do some programming, I'd say in some disciplines, it's a little bit easier. Finance is one where you tend to find people that are strong with macros and strong with development and can do that a little bit easier than some of the other disciplines. So it's definitely a strategy that works.
And as part of the maturity, automations is an example that supports citizen development, and that's exactly what it's trying to enable, where there's the functional domain knowledge, and then it's fairly straightforward to pair that where someone with the interest can then do that development. And then it's good to have some governance around that through a COE or other mechanism to ultimately make sure the controls are there, but absolutely pulling in more functional business resources and having tech enable that is a powerful combination.
Yeah.
I think it can be super powerful from that aspect, the citizen developer aspect, and it can be useful from a point solution perspective. At scale, it's a very difficult proposition, especially from the employee standpoint. It's very difficult to recruit and retain talent where you don't offer a career path to those people. And the technical person in a business department is a difficult career path.
Yeah. No, thank you guys. It was great having all of your valuable input. Thank you for everyone that joined. I think this is really the end of the webinar. One of the things that I wanted to mention is, we're glad to see that a lot of the people that joined today are people that are already somehow in the journey, that are looking to accelerate their pipeline. It definitely seems that at least the audience that joined today is more mature than some of the companies that haven't started. But I always encourage you to, just have an informal conversation with our team just to see what are some of the areas that maybe you're not yet considering and how can you really look at accelerating some of those initiatives. So, we're happy, Keith, Bill, Dan, we're all happy to discuss separately. And if we couldn't answer any of your questions, we would be happy to have a more private discussion later. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
So much. Have a great day.